This is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support me on Buy Me a Coffee, Subscribe Star, and Locals. And on Locals, you can also, if you're paying, be directly engaged with the work, make recommendations, and other things like that. And also don't forget to check out my Substack, where I write about things and say what I mean without necessarily fear of being censored by anyone. And all of those who are already supporting, thank you. Your support makes continual content possible. If you enjoy this content, feel free to support as well. So today is Introduction to Naval Strategy. So what we will not be talking about is tactics. Not a whole lot. I mean, you have to make some reference to tactics, of course. Ship design and different, eras of ship fighting. Again, only in a cursory way in order to discuss this. But the broad sweep of naval history and how strategy has changed as a result of that. So we have in the chat already, Minoan and GF. Hello, glad you're here. So the first thing, this is sort of the equivalent of my geostrategy videos. The first thing we have to understand is something like 2/3 or more of the surface of the planet is covered in water. Now, of all of that, for most of human history, it couldn't be sailed. So it's effectively, even though you would think that since most of the planet's covered in water, naval strategy and naval tactics would be the most important factor, that only has become the case in the last few hundred years, which we'll get to in a little bit. Most naval operations earlier on were in littoral or coastal regions. So the first thing we need to look at is the ocean itself, or seas, and we can include, say, the Caribbean Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the South China Sea, which are either totally inland or partially. Totally inland would be like the Aral Sea, or even like the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea. First thing is, unlike land, the ocean is flat. There are no mountains, rivers, hills, swamps, or forests to either create terrain disadvantages. So, for example, mounted troops don't do well in swamps or forests. Dismounted light troops do much better in hills and mountains than against heavily armed troops like, say, legionnaires. Nothing like that really exists. Now, there is still a topography of the ocean, and there are still geographic coastal areas that you can take into consideration. So the first thing is you'd have to take into consideration trade winds, reefs, swells, coastal crags, because again, throughout much of human history, naval combat took place very close to the shore. There is also no high ground at sea, unless you use naval aviation, which I'll get to a bit later. So unlike on land, if you occupied a hillock or the upper slopes of a mountain, where you would have an advantage over an opponent, or on the walls of a castle or a fortress shooting downward, you don't find stuff like that at sea, unless you have towers on your ship. But that's not that's a constructed height, not something natural at sea, because again, it's flat. The best way to view the open ocean is like the steppes of Eurasia or the Great Plains of North America, wide and flat and favorable to maneuver warfare. Bottlenecks do exist, such as straits, coves, and island chains. Smaller forces can defeat larger forces in such bottlenecks, as is the case on land. So, of course, one of the most famous land examples would be Thermopylae, where the Spartans didn't technically win, but they held off a much larger Persian force until outflanked. A naval equivalent would be the Battle of Salamis, where the Athenians and Themistocles found a very narrow choke point, which forced the Persians to battle, where their larger fleet was rendered impotent because they were competing on even terms now. We also see this in the First Battle of the Chesapeake, in 1781, where the French fleet was guarding the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, blockading Yorktown, which had Cornwallis held up in it, besieged by French and British land forces, led by Washington and Rochambeau. And the British were trying to break in to relieve the siege of Yorktown and failed, in part because the French anchored their flanks within the Chesapeake Bay. So that's something that you could see repeated at sea that you might see on land. And that was possible because, again, for much of naval warfare, fighting close to land was important. And so using the geography of... Now, but if you're fighting at the open ocean, like, say, the Battle of Midway or the Battle of Jutland, that's a whole different category. You don't really have those kinds of environmental issues. Now, in the age of galleys, parts of most of the ocean again was unnavigable, even much of the sea. So if you're in the Mediterranean, you're going to find battles that occur in much the same place in antiquity as in the Middle Ages, as in the early modern period, because the ships of the time were not really suitable for fighting in other more open areas. And that's in large part because galleys, at the end of the day, had to be pulled up shore, since they couldn't just anchor out at sea and sit there and blockade like the ships of the sail and the line or large battleships can today, or aircraft carriers. And so that means that only a very small percentage, again, of actual naval forces, ocean territory can be fought over. Now, it's not until the 20th century that you can fight beneath the waves, submarines, and in the air with naval aviation, both of which we'll deal with a bit later. Attacks from the air are the equivalent of high ground or on land, or even the advantages that air power convenes to a land army as well. Now, we need to look at the kinds of naval operations that a navy can perform. The most important is naval supremacy. If you don't control the sea, then all the other missions are, except for one, are more or less moot. So I define naval supremacy as all other naval operations, are in some sense moot if they cannot leave port or are interdicted by enemy forces. To ensure the successful execution of other naval missions, the enemy fleet must be found and destroyed. This is what is traditionally called a blue water navy in the modern context, beginning with the likes of Mahan. But even in antiquity and the Middle Ages, seeking and engaging the enemy fleet was often a precondition for military victory. Amphibious landing, where naval assets are used to transport and assist land forces in assaulting a coastal position. In antiquity, a famous example is Caesar's invasion of Britain, where his triremes even had catapults so they could do bombardment to soften the enemy positions. On a much larger scale, we see something like that with D-Day or the invasion of Okinawa in World War II. Logistical support. Throughout history, the most efficient way to supply an army was by sea. Naval logistics are often of vital importance to supporting a land invasion. Again, case in point, the Persian Wars. The great Persian fleet of Xerxes was used to supply the Persian army, which is why the Battle of Salamis was so strategic. After the Persian fleet was destroyed, much of the Persian army had to return to Asia, since it could not be supported from the Greek peninsula itself, which gave the Greeks a fighting chance the next year. Alternatively, we have independent naval operations, which are logistical for the fleet. So you're not sending supplies to an army, but you're sending supplies to your own ships to keep them in active duty. That's something you find more often in modern times than in antiquity, where ships can just sit out at sea and blockade a port for years on end in a rotational operation. Reconnoitering. Gathering intel is one of the most important tasks any military force can be assigned. Naval intelligence gathering, even to this day, is an elite profession. Blockade. The use of naval forces to prevent either supplies of enemy ships or commercial activity by non-aligned third parties to go to an enemy port to trade. This is a form of economic warfare used to harm the enemy's ability to fight. This kind of warfare is usually slow in yielding results, but generally irresistible if not broken. Classic examples of blockade could be the American blockade of the South in the American Civil War, the British blockade of Germany in World War I, and the American blockade of Japan in World War II. While these blockades took many years for the effect to come in, by the time we get to the end of these conflicts, Confederates, the Germans, and the Japanese are all starving and short on ammunition. So it's more or less irresistible if properly implemented. The one kind of military operation that an inferior fleet can use, even if it doesn't have naval control, is commerce raiding, using naval vessels that are usually small and fast to attack enemies' undefended commercial assets or transports. The counter to this is the convoy, a defensive operation whereby naval assets are used to protect the lightly armed and armored transport and commerce vessels of the Navy, a counter to commerce raiding. So these are all the different missions a fleet could have. Within the strategic context, you have stronger and weaker navies. Stronger navies seek to leave their ports and reach out and strike the enemy fleet or assist in some other military capacity like a blockade or an amphibious landing. That's what's generally called a blue water navy or a a traditional navy as we would think of. And it tends to be very expensive, and only great powers or mercantile states can afford them. A weaker power seeks what is called a fleet in being. These are ships that are not really meant to strike out and attack the enemy, but they generally are limited to littoral regions, and they use denial weapons. It's a good example would be a large submarine fleet. Now, the purpose is to hold the enemy fleet's attention. So if a stronger fleet exists, you want to prevent them from spreading out to enforce a blockade or to have a naval amphibious assault. And by having this fleet in being, you sort of threaten that any enemy fleet that breaks off to do a mission could, in theory, be attacked. And so you keep them from dispersing to perform other missions. And generally, fleets in beings aren't very successful throughout history. Sometimes they are, but generally speaking, if you're going up against another naval power that has the wealth and the resources to maintain a blue water fleet, you're kind of done. Now, I divide naval warfare into two broad categories. From 1175 BC, the Battle of the Delta, the first recorded naval battle in history, where Pharaoh fights the Sea Peoples, BC to 1571 AD, the Battle of Lepanto, the last great naval battle, the last great galley battle in the Renaissance, the age of littoral warfare. And this is what I mentioned earlier on. The littoral regions are those coastal regions where ships can engage other ships in supporting land operations. They can be hauled ashore at night, so they don't have to get sunk in storms or anything. And ships at the time were not really quite seaworthy to go out into deeper waters for fear of, again, storms and other things like that. And then the second age would be 1492 to the present, what I call the age of blue water warfare. And at this point, what happens is now naval operations kind of come into their own, and they can now be deployed all over the world and cross the open ocean in a way that could not have been done in the past. So let's sort of highlight the key elements of the age of littoral warfare. Naval warfare in this era was often close to shore. Ships were often made of reed or wood. Propulsion was usually a combination of wind, sails, and muscle power, rowing. Most of these ships would best be described as galleys. The Navy was the junior military partner in almost any ancient or medieval military society, and they engaged in what I call dependent operations. For the purpose of this discussion of naval warfare, naval operations were usually in support of some other land operation. Amphibious landing, Scipio at New Carthage, in the Punic War, Second Punic War, or Caesar's invasion of Britain. Logistical support, as the Persians at Salamis, or support in a siege, as Alexander the Great in Tyre. In each of these cases, the Navy was an adjunct to a broader land operation. We really do not have many examples of independent naval operations at this time. The only real example of what I can think of in this period that could be described as an independent naval operation would be the Viking Age of exploration. When the Norwegian and Icelandic Vikings sailed to North America, most of their planning necessarily focused on the logistical needs of the longboats. They expected little to no contact with other human populations. Hence why, in part, they didn't succeed in having these colonies out in the Western colonies. And so what's important here is with dependent operations, the Navy is in support of some broader land army objective. Whereas with the Norse exploration in the North Atlantic, most of the logistics, most of the planning is going to be revolved around the boats. I mean, yes, you have to have food and supplies for the people, especially when you have settlements, but you're not primarily thinking about equipping large bodies of Viking, warriors in order to raid and pillage other territories as a part of a conquest operation. They didn't assume they were going to find many people, so it was more of a settlement. Naval warfare had not yet come into its own. It was usually in support of some army operation. Even the supreme naval powers of Tyre, Athens, Carthage, and the Eastern Roman Empire all had to operate land forces. Now, Tyre usually would buy off the great Asian powers of like Babylon or Assyria, and it never really successfully developed a land army to defend itself completely. Athens did a little bit better, but still lost the Peloponnesian War. Carthage and the Eastern Roman Empire, both of which had a great naval tradition, did have large land armies to support their naval forces and to act independently in other operations. So, for example, Carthage, unlike Tyre and Athens, under the Barcids, beginning with Hamilcar, launched a major invasion of Spain to consolidate the central areas. The Eastern Roman Empire could wage campaigns in the Middle East and Balkans and parts of Eastern Europe without much reference to naval forces. These galleys were often not very seaworthy, being sunk by storms. According to Herodotus, about a quarter of the Persian fleet was sunk off the coast of Mount Athos. The Roman Republic suffered numerous naval disasters in the First Punic War. Part of this was due to the unique construction of the Roman quincremes and quadremes. I'll get to that definition a bit later. They used a boarding plank called the corvus, which had a heavy iron spike that when the bridge was dropped on an enemy vessel, you couldn't pull the bridge out, and they could just march their troops across to storm the vessel. But the actual bridge, the corvus, was stored on one side of the ship, making it heavy on one side. So in storms, they would just sink. And furthermore, the Romans, until the very end, weren't very good seamen. So usually these ships would sink because of one of three causes. One, they were not very well constructed. Two, they were not very well crewed. These were not skilled sailors. And three, design flaws like the corvus. We see this also with the Mongol invasion of Japan, with Kublai Khan's fleet, most of it sinking in the tsunami, except for the Koreans who actually built seaworthy ships. The other problem is for these ships was they could easily be destroyed without too much effort when they were beached. So a good example would be, according to Xenophon, at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartan commander Lysander defeated the Athenians at Aegis Potamoi by attacking them when they were beached. Their ships were beached, and he just captured them all with hardly out of fight. Or in the case of Gaiseric, the Vandal king in the 460s, he destroyed the Roman Emperor Majorian's fleet with fire anchored at New Carthage. So if you could act quickly enough and either burn the ships while they were in anchor or attack them and seize them, because often seizing ships was considered more valuable than just destroying them, you're not really going to have a good time of it. And so that's a bit harder to do in the age of sail, and certainly with steel ships as we have today. The only truly seaworthy ships that could actually sail out into the open ocean, were the Celtic Veneti, who were described by Julius Caesar in his Gallic Wars, who operated oaken vessels with sails, and they sailed back and forth from Gaul to Britain. And the North Sea is notoriously treacherous, as anybody who's studied the Spanish Armada knows. So this was a somewhat seaworthy vessel, but of course, other than sailing to Britain and Ireland, where else would these guys go? They didn't know about the New World, so they probably wouldn't even try. And then, of course, the Vikings themselves, who took a sort of island hopping route through the north, from Iceland to Greenland to, Labrador to the, Canadian coast, and possibly even New England. But again, these were not very common. Most ships were not that seaworthy. Naval combat itself revolved around three modes of engagement: ramming, boarding, and missile platforms. Ramming is pretty simple. It's where you have a ship with a beaked prow, usually bronze or iron, and you ram into an enemy vessel to do one of two things: cripple it by shearing off its oars. So your goal is to move in almost perpendicular so that you can just kind of clip all the oars so that the ship can't move, or you just come at it orthogonally to just hit it below the waterline and sink it. That's one. Okay, the other one is boarding. So you have grappling hooks. The Romans had essentially a catapult that fired a grappling hook at the Battle of Actium, called the harpagus, where they could then, and it was an iron chain, so once that grappling hook anchored into an enemy vessel, you could then winch it in close enough to board. That was much better than the corvus, because the corvus made the ship top heavy on one side and would sink often. Of course, you had boarding planks. And then, of course, there's just the old-fashioned, getting close enough and just jumping over. The advantages here was that you could actually capture the enemy vessel and incorporate it into your own fleet, as well as, lastly, mobile firing platforms. You could have towers, you have mounted archers, you could have catapults. The most famous and successful example in this time would be Greek fire, fired from siphons, which the Eastern Roman Empire used. and then cannons. Because there were some cannons on galleys at this point. Lepanto, the galleasses, had forward-facing cannons to either do one of two things: cripple the enemy's ability to move by firing chain shot at their sails, or, well, actually three ways: firing at the crew, because these again are galleys, so you could kill the crew with smaller firearms so it doesn't move, or just sink it outright with heavy caliber shot. The other point is, generally speaking at this time, and this goes to the Middle Ages as well, you had basically a convention of what I'll call 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, which are ships that have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 banks of oars. The trireme is 3 banks, and the quadreme is 4, the quincunxime is 5. And the general idea was that the more rowers you have, of course, the faster the ship can go. Now, there's an alternative theory that you never really had more than 3 banks of oars, and 4s and 5s, and larger ships, including 10s and 20s, were not actually banks beyond that, but the number of rowers on each side of the ship, which has the plausibility that it's practically impossible to build a 20-story ship out of wood. So unless the ancients were pulling our leg, maybe this theory that it talks about how many rowers were on a side rather than how many banks is possible. It's kind of an open question. I'm willing to go with banks of oars up to 5. Beyond that, it's kind of, I think, unfeasible. What we did see in this age, beginning with the Egyptians all the way up through the classical wars with Rome and Carthage to the Middle Ages, is starting out small, getting larger, going to gigantism, and then going back to small again. And this is partly due to resource access. There used to be large forests in Lebanon, the cities of Lebanon from the Bible, ancient Egypt, Italy, Greece, and North Africa, all of which were cut down to make giant fleets to fight in classical era. By the time of Actium, though, these forests have been severely reduced, and ships of necessity are much smaller. And so these sort of broader economic and resource scarcity shortages compel vessels to become smaller. And this continues throughout the Middle Ages. So that's the age of the galley. Now, beginning in 1492, we have the beginning of the Blue Water Age. So the important difference here are these: independent operations. An operation in which the goal and strategy are primarily naval, with land forces being a subsidiary and supporting role. Historical examples include the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean, British operations in the Caribbean in the wars of the 18th century, Japanese and U.S. forces in the Pacific War of 1941-45. In all of these cases, the demands of the naval force were the focus of the conflict. So in this case, the Army is now playing a junior role, and the Navy is dominant. This is generally unheard of in much of military history up to this point. So this marks a very serious departure from all the prior naval ages, where now independent naval operations become possible, and more than possible, necessary and essential. Now, what led to this? With the age of exploration for the Western European powers of Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England, naval operations necessarily became the dominant form of power expansion at this time, since the only way to get to the Americas or Africa was by sea. With regards to the Americas, this striving for naval monopoly on the Atlantic was first maintained by Spain for about 100 years, then the Netherlands, and finally England. The nation that could direct its foreign policy towards naval affairs without distraction was the best position to dominate the Atlantic. Portugal was small, and France was recovering from the 100 Years' War and the Burgundian War. When France became a rival to Spain on land, and in combination with naval overextension with fleets operating the Atlantic, Dutch coast, and Mediterranean, the Netherlands wrested control of the seas from Spain. The Netherlands lost their naval monopoly as a result of spending more and more of their military budget on armies to fend off first Spain and then later France. England, being an island, could of course spend the vast majority of its budget on a fleet without fear of military defeats on land, which put, of course, England in a dominant position for this whole area. The age of the blue water navies began with the invention of the carrack. The medieval cog, like the medieval cog, it was a deep-hulled ship able to carry cargo in open enough and hostile waters. And incorporated, and by hostile waters, I don't mean waters occupied by enemy forces, but waters that are prone to storms and other harmful activities for sailing. and incorporated innovations in sail design from the Islamic world and the Mediterranean. These ships allowed Spain and Portugal to sail to the New World and back. So, prior to the steam engine, in this age, naval mobility was limited by the wind. From the advent of the steam engine to the internal combustion engine to the nuclear engine, naval vessels can move in any direction without reference to the wind. So in the age of sail, roughly 1492 to sometime in the 1860s, we transition from sail to steam. Again, much more of the ocean can be actually fought over because now you have seagoing vessels that can leave littoral regions, but they're going to be stuck to basically where the winds are going. Certain parts of the Atlantic you're just not going to fight over because your ships can't sail when they're dead in the water. So there's still limits to how much of the ocean you can fight over and sail through, but there's a lot more than before. So the next thing is, without naval power, the age of exploration would have been impossible. Until the 19th century, most European settlement of Africa and Asia was coastal. This was due to the fact that their advanced weaponry cannons could be fired from ships and be used to support land operations. But to haul advanced weapon systems inland was too difficult at the time. In the Americas, disease, along with underdeveloped level of indigenous populations, allowed small European expeditionary forces to conquer vast inland empires. So these naval operations still focused on supporting land forces, especially in the age of colonization. But again, a lot of these land operations, of course, themselves were to find places of portage for the ships so that you could still have a presence in the Americas or a presence in Africa. And so again, we see this decisive flip from the Army to the Navy as the more important factor here. From the ship of the line to the dreadnought battleship to the aircraft carrier, the main advantage of blue water naval assets is their power projection capability. You can strike at the enemy further away, either at sea or on land. The rise of naval aviation as an arm of its own in World War II fundamentally revolutionized warfare. You could engage enemy fleets without seeing them. First example being the Battle of the Coral Sea. You can strike deep inland with bombing raids, and you can patrol for enemy submarines. In this age, naval engagement shifted away from close quarters to long distance. At the beginning of this age, boarding with Marines and crippling of the enemy sails was still in use well into the 19th century. With the advent of all-metal ships powered by steam and later diesel, boarding fell out of favor. Of course, there's no sails to cripple either. A brief revival of ramming was attempted in the age of steam in the 19th century, but was short-lived. Later, more powerful guns decisively ended traditional short-range engagement methods. With the rise of naval aviation, even the big guns went out of favor, of course, battleships being phased out. In both Caribbean and Pacific Ocean, the Spanish, English, and Americans engaged in island hopping. It is not practical to conquer every island your enemy holds, so find the most strategically important and ignore the rest. Let them wither on the vine. Now, strategy in one sense sort of transcends any competitive realm, whether it's military conflicts on land with armies, conflicts at sea, conflicts that are political, just political, so like intra-political, like Democrat versus Republican or Labor versus Tory, or even, ideological. I'm trying to get my ideas out and counter yours. But there are certain overlapping consistent principles. But what's interesting here is the principles that work on land and that have certain, what you could say, fudge factors don't really work as well at sea. So the first one is concentration of force, which basically means maintaining your military assets in a single geographic location for use. Ulysses S. Grant once said, victory goes to those who arrives most quickly with the most troops. On land warfare, some examples for dividing forces can be used on a case-by-case basis. Classic example is the double envelopment, which is Hannibal at Cannae. Lee tried to perform this at Chancellorsville. Might have actually pulled it off had Jackson not got himself shot reconnoitering by his own troops. But there is some justification for doing that. But doing that at sea is tantamount to suicide. You really don't want to divide your fleet up. Classic example on the strategic level was Japan in 1942. In 1942, they made their fleets were divided into three-pronged attack. One to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, one to attack Midway, and then one in the South Pacific to attack New Guinea. All three efforts were defeated by the Allies. you know, and of course they lost 4 carriers at Midway, which is half their carrier fleet. Well, if they'd have just had all of their carrier fleet, 8 carriers, and just sent them to one place, they probably would have won. Now, it's an open question what would have been the more useful, send them all to Alaska, send them all to the New Guinea, or send them all to Midway. But regardless, by splitting them up, they ensured their own defeat. Now, again, sometimes on land that makes sense, but at sea it generally doesn't. And so your goal is to arrive there quickly with the most, which is in line with Grant's dictum. The other thing is with lines of communication. Well, so on land, that means the army has to be able to trace a line of supply back to some logistics hub. One of the classic ways of bringing an army to fight is straddling their line of communication, which is exactly what Alexander the Great did at the Battle of Issus. When he straddled, as Darius was moving down to meet him, Alexander outmaneuvered him and got behind him, forcing him to battle because he was out of supply. Ships carry their own supply, so it's not quite the same at sea. It's not like, an army, which has to be supplied regularly because they don't have large vessels to hold prepared foods and whatnot. But what you can do, this is especially successful in the age of galleys, is interpose your fleet between the enemy and his harbor, so that he has to fight you if he wants to get back to portage. We also see this with the use of denying ports. So through combined land naval operations, you can essentially deny the enemy ports to use. Now, Alexander the Great did this in the Persian War when he invaded Persia. Now, he didn't really get naval assets until he conquered Phoenicia, but he took out the great city of Halicarnassus, Tyre, and Gaza, which basically denied the Persian fleet any bases so that it was basically unable to operate. That's another strategy you could use. One strategy that has become quite popular in the modern age and was not really possible in antiquity is blockade. Blockade is a form of economic warfare whereby you strangle the enemy's imports, bringing them to heel. Now, the reason why you couldn't do that before was, very effectively at least, was because the galley ships could not be left at sea indefinitely, or even for any length of time. They had to be beached at the end of the day. And this continues through the Middle Ages as well, which makes a tight blockade very difficult. In fact, even if you have naval superiority, it's very difficult to interdict enemy vessels. So, for example, even though Carthage maintained naval supremacy, the Syracusan tyrant Agathocles sent a fleet and just made a beeline for Libya, landed there, and then attacked Carthaginians through an invasion of Africa. And the naval operations and naval strategy at the time was not, you couldn't have that tight level blockade, so an enemy could even attack you even though you technically had a larger fleet. The Romans had naval supremacy in the Second Punic War, and yet Hannibal's brother Gisco lands in Liguria, modern-day Lombardy, in Italy, to try to alleviate his brother's condition, which he fails, but still, it could be done. Now, imagine in the American Civil War, World War I, or World War II, the Confederates, the Germans, or the Japanese trying to do anything like that. It's laughable. Can't envision that. Because at this point, we have ships that can be left out in open water continually. Now, they still have to be on rotation, so the troops can go back for some R&R, or in case of the wooden ships of the line, they can go back to port to be fixed. But they can be left out at sea. They won't sink. And so now you can begin the use of one of the most effective naval strategies, economic blockade. It takes a while to implement, and you have to be very persistent in its application, but if done properly, it's irresistible. Most weaker forces try to fight that with their own form of economic warfare, commerce raiding, which again usually is light, fast vessels. In the modern 20th century, it includes submarines, and the Germans became experts at commerce raiding. But generally, it's a weak man's weapon, and it's not effective in the long run. So, for example, the Battle of Atlantic in World War II, objectively, the Germans inflicted more financial costs on the Allies than on themselves. They sunk more tonnage, and yet it didn't matter in the end. It didn't matter in the end. And so, at that point, if your enemy is willing to eat the cost, it doesn't work. So let's sort of briefly summarize what we've discussed. The first thing to consider is the actual space you're fighting in itself, the ocean. And in broadly 3 waves of transportation innovation, we see more and more of the ocean accessible to naval combat. Sail and rowing with galleys was just the littoral region because these are shallow hull vessels. Beginning with the carrack in the 15th century, you can now sail the entire world. A carrack is what was used by Magellan. Even though he was killed in the Philippines, his crew circumnavigated the world in the 16th century. Unbelievable. Nobody would have thought that possible before. But there's large parts of the ocean that still cannot be sailed. With the age of steam in the 19th century and beyond, more advanced propulsion systems, you can largely ignore the trade winds and wind and a lot of that stuff and just sail wherever you want. Under your own steam, under your own steam or your own motive power. So in that regard, the history of naval strategy is through the innovation in mobility, in motility. More and more of the ocean is open for operations. There are the naval operations that one can engage in include naval supremacy, amphibious landing, logistical support, siege warfare, reconnoitering, blockade, and commerce raiding, and convoy. We can divide naval warfare and strategy into broadly 2 categories: the age of littoral warfare, or galley, 1175 BC, the Battle of the Delta, to 1571 AD, the Battle of Lepanto. The dominant feature here is that ships are generally not seaworthy and have to be beached at the end of the day. Most combat is ramming, boarding, or from more advanced countries like Rome or even China, or Carthage, some sort of primitive missile weapons like catapults or archers. Only the Veneti and the Vikings I'm aware of really had seaworthy vessels, but the Veneti didn't know about the New World, so they just sailed around the British Isles, and the Vikings were already at the edge of the known world and couldn't really go. They already had their hands full with fighting the Franks and the Britons and the Russians. So at that point, they didn't really pursue that much further, especially with the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which made traveling in that northern island hopping route much more difficult. These ships were very vulnerable to be destroyed on land, which again made the Army much more dominant than the Navy. The Navy is dependent in its operations on the Army. Okay, then we have the age of the Blue Water Navy, which I say, begins with Columbus, because what really is interesting about Columbus and the Spanish is the first time that a country develops the ability to sail across an ocean to another continent. That's huge. Like that right there is the dividing line, and that comes with a carrack. Now we have independent naval operations where logistical strategic planning is for the needs of the fleet, not the Army, and the Army's there to support the fleet. We see that nations that can afford a larger naval budget do better, so those that can dispense with an army, that would either be island nations like Britain or nations endowed with weak neighbors like the United States, to do so. We also see that in this age, in the first half, the first part from 1492 to the 1860s, you had to worry about the wind. And even though more of the ocean was opened up, parts of it you just wouldn't sail or fight over. Then you had the invention of steam, which led to self-directed ships that continued up to nuclear power. So now that's a thing. You also have the advent of naval aviation and submarines, which adds a horizontal dimension to naval warfare, which historically you didn't really have because it's flat and you're all on the surface of the ocean. We also see that in fighting at sea, dividing your naval vessels is not a good idea. You don't want to do that. If you can attack the enemy while they're strung out before they've organized, just like on land, you can do a lot of damage. Lines of communication are not as prominent as on land because ships can carry larger supplies and can move to other ports more easily. But you can still deny them portage, which would essentially leave them logistically isolated. And then we also see the rise of economic warfare through commerce raiding and blockade in a way that became much more feasible because ships could just be out at sea longer and not have to go home right away and be beached. So that's a brief introduction to naval strategy. K14Y29, hello. If I recall, the Tsardom of Russia used flamethrowing galleys against the Ottoman Empire and won over the Swedish Navy with something more or less like this. Interesting. Not aware of that, but I mean, Greek fire or the equivalent is very effective against wooden vessels. Well, everyone, that's all I have for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.